Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. The book came out actually 3 weeks ago today, and I've done a lot of presentations in a lot of different places, but never quite in a setting like this. It's dark now, but I like that background. It's always good to be here in Colorado. In 2008, I covered the presidential campaign, and since this was a swing state, I came through here a lot with John McCain, with Barack Obama, with Sarah Palin, all over the state. Denver, Pueblo, Colorado Springs, Fort Collins, Grand Junction, Durango. So it's fun to be here. Well, the reason I wrote this book has to do with the way we as Americans see the world. In the last decade or so, there's been an enormous amount of attention focused on the emergence of India and China, and rightfully so. But it also seems to me that there's been dramatic changes taking place in Brazil that have occurred kind of under the radar in a way. In 2003, Goldman Sachs invented this new category of emerging economy called the BRIC Group. Brazil, Russia, India, China. But the focus really has been on those last two letters, the I and the C. And there's a lot that we as Americans can learn about this enormous country that is larger than the continental United States, down there in the southern hemisphere. When I decided I was going to write this book, I got a quick lesson in why I needed to write it. I was at a dinner party in New York, and a friend of mine, it was at his apartment, lifted a toast to me for undertaking this project. And there was another guest sitting next to me. She was a high school librarian. And she said to me, well, why would you want to write a book about Brazil? I said, because it's such an interesting and important place. And she says to me, well, important how? And I said, well, where do you think Brazil ranks in terms of the world's economies? And she said, she thought about it. She said, well, 35th. And I said, no, 8th and rising. And then I said, and what do you think Brazil's largest export products are? She had to think about that a little bit. And she said, oh, hides and bananas. And I said, well, actually, last year, Brazil's largest export product was airplanes, produced at the Embraer factory in the state of São Paulo. And that kind of took her back. And the number 2 product, I told her, was automobiles and car parts. Now, that's not the case every year, but it happened to be the case then. And it says that Brazil is not, our classic image, as Frank Sinatra has that song, there's an awful lot of coffee in Brazil. I think that's the classic image of the country. But it's also an industrial power. And if I were to have that same conversation with her today, I would point to a couple of other things that have happened since I started writing this book. For example, 2 weeks ago, a Brazilian investment group bought Burger King for $4 billion. The same group of people 2 years ago bought Anheuser-Busch. So if you're going to have a Budweiser, or if you're going to eat a Whopper, you are at this point then going to be contributing to the growth of the Brazilian economy. That's the sort of thing that I think we need to be aware of, how the country has changed. I did an interview with the BBC in Washington last Friday, and the first question the interviewer says to me is, tell me 2 things about Brazil that I don't know. I had to kind of think on my feet there. But one thing came to mind right away. And I said, well, are you aware that Brazil is now the 4th largest creditor of the United States? that everybody knows that China has $2 trillion in plus in reserves denominated in US dollars. Japan comes second, the United Kingdom is third, but Brazil is now in fourth place. They have currency reserves of over $250 billion, and they have $165 billion of that parked in US Treasury securities. And she said, yes, I didn't know that. That large amount of money in reserves is the result of a boom in the Brazilian economy over the last decade or so. In exports of agricultural products and of industrial products. A triangular relationship that's developed where Brazil supplies the raw materials that China needs to make products that it then exports to the United States. So Brazilian supplies of iron ore, copper, aluminum, timber, and soybeans, so that the emerging Chinese middle class either consumes itself because it wants more protein, or that it feeds to pigs or cows and consumes that way. So this interesting triangular relationship has developed, and I don't think we're all that aware of that either. So that's what drove me to get started on this. And I wanted to break also with the popular cultural images of Brazil. When Americans think of Brazil, I think that we tend to automatically go to certain images. Pelé with a soccer ball, the girl from Ipanema in a skimpy bathing suit, Carnival with the people in the lavish costumes, the Amazon in flames, there may be one or two more. The Christ statue overlooking Rio. All that is part of Brazil, but it's not the entirety of the country. That's why this book has this cover. This is downtown Sao Paulo. I deliberately wanted a different image of Brazil. I wanted the notion of a dynamic, growing, powerful, energetic Brazil. Of course, the national colors are green and yellow, so that was the color scheme chosen. So this is this book is an attempt to look at the country, not just the politics and the economics, but a survey of what Brazil is like today as we begin the second decade of the 21st century. It's not a scholarly book, it's a popular book. And I did some events in Washington where academics were kind of almost complaining a little bit about it being too popular in tone, but that's fine because that's what I wanted. And for that reason, it doesn't have it's not structured the way that an academic book would be. I have a baseline. The baseline is my personal experience, my personal interpretation of what Brazil is like. My relationship with the country began in 1972, and so that's my starting point. And it's a book that talks about how Brazil got from where it was then to where it is today. So let me tell you where it was in 1972 so you have a sense of how dramatic the transformation has been. I first went to Brazil actually 38 years ago this month. The country was ruled by a military dictatorship. The political parties had been outlawed. There were two artificial groupings. Congress wasn't shut, but some leading political figures had their rights, political rights stripped from them so that they could no longer run for office, and that included a very popular former president. There was censorship of the press. I was working at the time for a Brazilian television network, and I remember going to a mid-afternoon story meeting, and there was a military officer there saying what they could and couldn't do. Music was censored, films were censored, newspapers and magazines, obviously. It was a very repressive situation. there were people disappearing, not to the extent that it occurred in Argentina or Chile, but nonetheless it created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. Economically, Brazil was, as I mentioned, the Frank Sinatra song, the economy was focused on primary products like coffee, sugar, cocoa, that sort of thing. And when you landed at the airport in Rio, it was a real old-fashioned airport. I confess that my initial reaction when I landed was thinking that it looked like it was a scene out of that Woody Allen movie, Bananas. It wasn't the gleaming, polished, ultra-modern airport that Rio has today. And the economic structure of the country was such that you had a very small elite at the top that owned most of the land, controlled most of the economy, had most of the income. And you had at the bottom a large mass that was living in poverty or which was completely excluded from the economy. Not by accident, that small group at the top of the pyramid was almost exclusively white, and not by accident that large mass at the bottom was black, brown, or indigenous. That was the nature of Brazil in 1972. Today, if we look at the country, well, politically, Brazil is a flourishing democracy, vibrant, noisy, tumultuous, fractious, all those adjectives. But I think that's a sign of health. There's 21 political parties, not all of them represented in Congress, but at least a dozen have seats in Congress. You have a aggressive press that doesn't hesitate to criticize the government. You have a situation in which there's a clear division of powers, and the judiciary can check the executive. The executive respects that division of powers. It's not a dictator imposing his will. It's a society in which the democratically elected governments have, over the last two presidencies, the two men who have held that office, have focused on the issue of income distribution. Brazil's terribly skewed distribution of wealth has improved. It's still got a long way to go, but there's a national consensus that this is something to be ashamed of and needs to be addressed, and the governments are doing it. Now, economically, I've kind of given you a hint of where the country is. As I said, it's the number eight economy in the world. I just saw the Economist Intelligence Unit is predicting that next year Brazil will rise to 7, passing Italy. And when I was last in Brazil, at the end of last year, I noticed that the new national slogan you see in government propaganda or on television ads, public service ads, talks about Brazil as the 5th power. So that they think that in 10 to 15 years they can join that elite group of world powers, which by their calculation would be China, the US, India, the European community, and then Brazil. I'll talk a little bit more about the problems that have to be overcome in order for Brazil to do that. But it's a realistic goal. Now, some of you may have heard this famous prediction that Brazil is the country of the future. A European writer named Stefan Zweig made that prediction in 1942, I think it is, when he went to Brazil fleeing the Nazis. And that prediction has been almost like a curse. The Brazilians like to say that it's as much as a prophecy, it's a burden. And no matter how the country has developed economically, socially, culturally, it's always seemed to have fallen short of that brilliant future predicted for it. To the point that Brazilians, you may have heard this expression as well, that Brazilians with their wonderfully malicious sense of humor say that Brazil is the country of the future and always will be. But one of the things that the emergence of India and China has done is to relieve Brazil of that burden. No one, they bury that notion that they're the country of the future. It's a weight lifted off their shoulders. To be one of the top 5 is glory enough. And so the goals are now more realistic. They're optimistic, of course, but there's much more realism in the way Brazil sees itself, its role in the world. Now, let me talk a little bit more about the economy, and then we can talk about the presidential election that's coming up next month. As I've indicated, Brazil really has 2 strong economic legs on which to stand. When Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, came to Brazil in 2005, he said publicly that Brazil was an agricultural superpower. He was acknowledging what was already obvious. Brazil is the largest exporter in the world, not just of the stuff I mentioned before, coffee, sugar, cocoa, but now orange juice, chicken, cattle, let's see, what am I forgetting here? There's a soy, well, we're still number 1 as exporters. But Brazil is, U.S. Department of Agriculture predicts that Brazil is going to overtake us sometime in probably the next 5 years. And probably in the next decade, Brazil is going to overtake us to become the world's largest exporter of foodstuffs in general. Now, I'm from the Midwest, as you may hear in my accent. I'm from Illinois, and I have cousins who are farmers on the Illinois-Wisconsin state line. And I know from wandering around the interior of Brazil, I've run into a lot of farmers from Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, who know that Brazil has a competitive advantage that we never will have. Huge amounts of land that are still not cultivated, a climate that allows 2, and in some cases even 3 crops a year, a water supply that is unequaled in the world. So all of this makes Brazil the agricultural superpower that Colin Powell mentioned. The other leg, of course, is the industrial base that I mentioned in terms of the auto industry and the the aircraft manufacturers. And Brazil has been very good about finding niches. It knows that it doesn't have the capital to do everything the way that we do. So, for example, I mentioned the Embraer aircraft company. They know that they can't compete with Boeing and Airbus. They're third in that market. So what they cleverly did was focus on a niche. Let's do commuter jets. So the odds are that if you fly from Denver to, I don't know, Albuquerque or Salt Lake City, a medium run, you're probably flying on an Embraer jet. Most people don't know that. And actually, I mentioned that in 2008, I traveled with presidential and vice presidential candidates. Sarah Palin traveled during the 2008 campaign in an Embraer jet. Who knew that, right? So there is this industrial base, and it's fortified even further by an extraordinarily favorable energy situation. Brazil has, in 1975, decided, after the first oil shock, decided that, well, we can't afford this. And a government program began to develop ethanol made from sugarcane. It's taken a long time. It required a lot of effort, a lot of investment to make it work. But Brazil is today the world leader in renewable fuels. every car in Brazil, almost every car, all the cars manufactured now have what they call flex fuel engines that can run on ethanol, gasoline, or any mixture of the two. And that's one of the reasons why Brazilian automobile exports are booming and production is booming. Besides ethanol, there's hydropower. Excuse me. The Amazon Basin obviously is the largest watershed in the world. There are other river systems, and Brazil has barely tapped into that. But let's see, of the world's 5 largest dams, I think, let me see, it's 3 that are in Brazil. And that's energy to go to the industrialized cities of São Paulo, this place, and Belo Horizonte. Then in 2007, as if that wasn't enough, came the dramatic offshore oil discoveries off the coast of Rio and São Paulo that promised, if developed properly and if the initial soundings are accurate, to vault Brazil into the ranks of the world's leading oil exporters, oil and gas. But it's going to require enormous amounts of investment. It's going to be years before it's developed, but it's already having an impact. Every time I see Hugo Chavez in Brazil now, the leader of Venezuela, he's much more deferential to the Brazilians because he knows that their reserves could perhaps equal what Venezuela is going to be able to get at in realistic terms, and that it's much, it's a higher quality of oil, and so the politics of energy are going to change in Latin America because of this discovery. So Brazil has all these things going in its favor, and at this moment, Brazilians are sitting really pretty. This is going to be a year when they grow 7%. Yes, yeah, right. Look at the rest of the world. Brazil's biggest rival in Latin America had been Mexico. But the Mexican economy contracted last year by 6% because they're tied to us. And we have our problems, which we're all familiar with. Brazil has diversified its trade, so it has a quarter of its trade with North America, a quarter with Europe, a quarter with Asia, and a quarter with Latin America. So it's less vulnerable to these kinds of crises, and it has a domestic market of 200 million people. That's nothing to sneeze at. And the economic policies of the last 16 years have been aimed at incorporating all those people into the economy. In 1994, there was a successful government plan to attack inflation. And as a result of that, poor people for the first time didn't have to go spend their wages the minute they got them, stock up on rice and beans because in a week your salary is going to have been eroded. They could buy appliances on time, and that was a huge stimulus to domestic consumption. They could afford to keep their children in school instead of sending them out to work to make more income for the family. So that was really the turning point. And so here we are, the country's really looking pretty, sitting pretty. Next month, however, is a crossroads, an important crossroads for the country. October 3rd, I say next month, it's 2 weeks away. There's going to be a presidential election. And for the first time since the end of the military dictatorship that I mentioned early on, that fell in 1985. For the first time since then, neither of the 2 important presidents of Brazil who are responsible for this boom that I'm talking about, Fernando Henrique Cardoso and Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, neither of them are on the ballot. Instead, there's going to be 2 people who are cut from a very different mold. They're both technocrats, they're both economists. Neither of them is charismatic in the way that Lula or Fernando Henrique Cardoso have been. And one of those two is going to emerge as the next president of Brazil. Let me talk a little bit about who they are, because you're going to be hearing their names in years to come. Lula's anointed successor is the candidate of his party, the Workers' Party, is a woman named Dilma Rousseff. She has been his chief of staff. She is the daughter of a Bulgarian immigrant to Brazil. He came to Brazil as World War II was breaking out, fleeing the rise of fascism. She was raised, he became a successful businessman. She was raised in a middle-class situation, but as a college student, even as a high school student, got into revolutionary activities, armed resistance to the dictatorship. In 1970, at the age of 23, she was arrested because she belonged to a revolutionary cell that was involved in bank robberies that were being undertaken so as to fund arms purchases and armed resistance to the dictatorship. She was held for almost 3 years. She was tortured. She was beaten. She came out, went into conventional politics, became an economist, joined the Workers' Party only 9 years ago. But Lula took a shine to her, especially after his previous chief of staff and his finance minister were removed because of involvement in corruption scandals. So she is at this point the front runner. I looked at the weekend polls yesterday morning. In Brazil, to win an election, you have to get 50% plus one of the vote. Otherwise, there's a runoff 3 weeks later. She's just at the cusp of the 50%. The margin of error is like 3%, so maybe she's at 47, maybe she's at 53. Odds are that she's going to win, whether in the first round or the second, we can't tell you. But she's most likely the next president of Brazil, a woman, the first woman president. She's never run for office before. And she's going to have to make a lot of important decisions. I've been talking and for the sake of conversation, let's assume she's going to win. The other candidate, José Serra, is also a very capable person, an economist who's served as planning minister, health minister, ran for president in 2002. Lula beat him. He came back to be governor of São Paulo, the country's largest state, 42 million people. But it looks right now like he's not going to win. So let me talk a bit about the kind of issues that Dilma would have to address as the president of Brazil. I've been very positive, but now I want to go to the area of, well, yes, but. This growth has strained the limits of Brazil's physical infrastructure. Transportation, communications, they're really being strained. Ports are terribly overcrowded. All those soybeans that are being exported, the wait to get them out of the ports is terrible. Beyond that, human capital, human infrastructure, the demands for skilled labor, for technicians, for engineers, all that sort of thing, is so great that Brazil's having trouble keeping up. Petrobras, the state oil company, is going to have to develop those oil funds I'm talking about. They say they need 250,000 technicians and engineers in the next decade. Where's that going to come from? The universities can't keep up. They've allowed a lot of fly-by-night private universities to spring up. They're not training people the right way. So that's a problem. I would also, this is a very personal evaluation, I would also say that as Lula prepares to leave office, there's a certain air of triumphalism, almost hubris, that prevails in the government and is likely to carry over into the next government if his candidate wins. There's a sense that we have the golden touch. Everything we touch turns to gold. Everything, we have a magic touch. And it doesn't acknowledge, number one, the tremendous preparatory work that Fernando Henrique Cardozo did in his 8 years as president to create the conditions that allow this boom to go on. And it also doesn't take into account the commodities boom that the Chinese rise has created worldwide. Instead, it's like Lula knows everything. He is the world's greatest leader. And therefore, the attitude that accompanies that is, well, on those oil deposits, we don't need the foreigners. We don't need their investment. Let's cut them out of it. There's legislation pending that would, in fact, reserve all that offshore potential wealth only for Brazilian companies. There's also talk of legislation to shut out the foreigners from the agricultural boom, to limit sales of land in the interior where the big growth is taking place. I think that's the wrong path. And let's see if the next government can resist it or whether it's going to fall victim to that temptation. And we also have to ask, Lula is leaving office as an enormously popular figure. 8 years in office, his approval rating is somewhere between 75 and 80%. Where else in the world do you get that kind of number? So he's more popular than the party. Brazilian law allows him to sit out these 4 years, and if he so desires, run again in 2014. So what's the relationship going to be between him and his successor, who's really dependent on his image to get where she is? Is he going to go into retirement and sit on his front porch? He's only 65. Or is he going to sit it out and kind of pull strings, mess about with who goes into her cabinet and what the policies are, and then expect her to step aside in 4 years? Well, how likely is it that a sitting president is going to step aside for somebody else? We're seeing that kind of scenario developing in Russia, right, with Putin and Medvedev. But Brazil's not Russia. It's a different kettle of fish. So all of these things are very much on the minds of voters in Brazil when they go to the polls on October 3rd. And they're things that we, as people observing the international scene, need to keep in mind as the country continues to grow and its relationship with the United States deepens. I think I've gone on for a good long time. I hope somebody will ask about our bilateral relationship, the relationship with the United States and Brazil and how that's developed. Or would you really do that now? Or?
Let's talk about it.
Yeah, okay. The relationship is very cordial, but there are some issues that I think could create problems. Brazil is an ally and partner in a lot of areas, but it could become a rival. And there's a couple of issues where there's already tensions emerging. Now, one of the things about Lula is that even though he is very much left to center, his party was originally socialist, and he promised originally a rupture with the world capitalist system. But in his 8 years, he's won the applause of Wall Street. He's adhered to economic policies that win the applause of investors around the world. Brazil is now the third largest, target of investment in the world. So he has been viewed in the United States as a guy that we can do business with. And in fact, he had a very cordial relationship with George Bush, even though he's a man of the left. He used to talk about my friend Comrade Bush. And as a correspondent in Brazil, I covered a couple of their meetings, and it was amazing to see the two of them eating barbecue together at the presidential residence in Brasilia. They really connected on that level. And they felt at ease with each other in a way that Lula did not, in a way that George Bush did not feel with Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Now, with Obama, the relationship also has been cordial on the personal level. Brazil is a country where the majority of the population is, by the way we define racial categories, non-white. And so, as Lula has remarked, you look at Obama and he's a guy that you could imagine running into walking down the street in Rio or Sao Paulo or Salvador da Bahia. He looks like a Brazilian. Brazilians like that, they identify with that. And there were great hopes that after these 8 years of George Bush, where the relationship didn't develop the way the Brazilians would like to have seen it develop, that things were suddenly going to be wonderful with Barack Obama. Instead, they have continued pretty much along the same course. The relationship was initially quite friendly. When there was a coup d'etat in Honduras last year, the United States and Brazil started out together, jointly trying to resolve that situation. It ended up in a situation where we were on one side, Brazil was on the other side, and there's quite a bit of bitterness back and forth. Hugo Chavez played both of us very astutely and drove a wedge between Brazil and the United States. And then earlier this year in May, I imagine a lot of you remember this initiative that Brazil and Turkey had in the Security Council of the United Nations to attempt to resolve the Iranian nuclear dispute, the impasse. It didn't go well. The State Department got quite irritated with what the Brazilians were doing. It collapsed. Brazil ended up with egg on its face. There's some bad feeling right now between the two governments on that issue. And there's a related nuclear issue that might be a bilateral problem down the line. Brazil has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It does not intend to build a bomb. In fact, it destroyed its nuclear program in the 1980s, along with Argentina. The two of them, the traditional rivals and enemies, negotiated an accord that ended their nuclear programs, and which President Clinton used to cite to India and Pakistan as an example of how you can, come to an agreement. But despite signing the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Brazilian Navy has visions of nuclear submarines. And of course that involves enrichment beyond the normal level for for producing electricity. And Brazil refuses to sign the additional protocol that would in fact prohibit that kind of thing, and has not endorsed the Iranian position, but does favor the notion that countries have the right to develop nuclear power and nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, even when it's kind of sketchy as to who's doing it and exactly what the need is to do it. So that's something that's moving in the background in our bilateral relationship, and which I worry about, because Brazil is intent on getting the nuclear submarines, whether building it themselves or buying them from the French. And when that happens, there's going to be, if push comes to shove, and it's going to be very, very difficult and delicate to resolve that situation. Now, that said, the relationship continues to be cordial on many, many levels. And I did a radio interview week before last, and the radio host said to me, well, you're talking about how Brazil is a partner and a strategic partner and ally. Well, how come they're so friendly with that Chavez guy? And I said, well, it may look like that, but it's much more complicated than it appears. And in fact, Brazilian conduct and national interest converges with ours on many levels. The Brazilians think that it's nuts that this guy who leads a country of 28 million people that is dependent on oil, and he has the classic look of the Latin American military guy, the strong man. They think it's crazy that he presumes to speak for all of Latin America. They view that as being their role. 200 million people, a flourishing democracy, the 8th largest economy. Who are the Venezuelans to speak for Latin America? So they have been undermining, very quietly, a lot of initiatives that Chavez has come up with. South Atlantic Treaty Organization, that was one of Chavez's pet projects. A Bank of the South with oil money from Venezuela. And to Brazil, that conflicts with their own National Development Bank, that they like to have financing sales of equipment and all kinds of products around Latin America. And Chavez is planning to build a pipeline from Caracas to Buenos Aires across Brazilian territory. Every time he's come up with something that would strengthen his role and his power, the Brazilians have quietly undermined or sabotaged it. Now, they're doing it for their purposes, because of what they view as their proper role in the world. But it does also converge with what the American government views as American national interest. So it's a very complicated picture. Overall, the bilateral relationship is strong and largely friendly, but as I mentioned, there are these clouds on the horizon. So, having said that, I'm happy to take questions about anything and everything related to Brazil. So feel free to fire away, folks.
Debbie will give the ground rules for the question and answer.
Great. We'd like to remind you to please ask a question. It's not your opportunity to take a platform and make your own statement, but present a brief question, please, to our speakers.
Larry, when I was in Angola last time, Brazil, or Petrobras had a big semi-submersible stacked up in the harbor in Luanda. And I'm wondering if they've been involved in building more of these semi-submersibles for deep water.
The answer is yes. But there's a money problem, right? I mean, it costs money to build that, and they're estimating that they may have like 85 billion barrels offshore. There's going to be huge amounts of investment required to get at that, and it's all way down underneath what they call the sub-salt level. So there's not enough of those, but it's interesting that it's in Angola because they view Africa, and especially Portuguese-speaking Africa, as an area where their influence can expand beyond Latin America. They're no longer interested just in being a regional power. They want to be on the world stage. They want a permanent seat on the Security Council of the UN. And Africa is one area where, because of the racial composition, the cultural ties that go back to 1500, they view themselves as being a player.
You know that Angola and Brazil are proof of continental drift because they both speak Portuguese.
Okay.
Our next question is over here.
A few years ago, I had the opportunity to go down to Brazil a number of times every month. And each evening, you could see hundreds of miles of rainforest burning. And could you tell us a little bit about what's going on with that and deforestation there?
Sure. That's an enormously important question. And Brazil's stewardship, I'm going to say something here that when I say it, Brazil always gets me in trouble. But tough luck. And I'm not in Brazil. Their stewardship of the Amazon has been deficient. There's this notion that the Amazon is ours. I have a whole chapter on this issue because it's so important. This notion that the Amazon is ours, it's nobody else's business what we do. You guys became rich by destroying your environment, don't tell us what to do. And as a result of that, there has been enormous deforestation. Let me put this in American terms. Roughly the size of the state of New Jersey every year. And that has rightly drawn the criticism of environmental groups and governments across the world. Now, there tends to be a correlation between, if you look at a graph, you'll see that as the economy grows, so does deforestation. And when the economy falls, so does deforestation. There's a definite linkage between the two. So, what happens now with a booming Brazil? Well, a couple of things. In world forums, Brazil has been obstructionist in the past because of this philosophy that it's our business, keep your nose out of it. But at Copenhagen last December, I noticed a shift in the Brazilian position that I thought was encouraging, important. For the first time, Brazil made a pledge to reach certain goals over the next decade. Now, it's a non-binding pledge. There's no way to enforce it. But for the first time, Brazil is on record as saying, okay, we're going to cut our emissions by 40%. And Brazil is in the top 4. I mean, China's now passed the United States as the number 1 emitter of greenhouse gases. So it's China, US, Indonesia is 3rd, I believe, and Brazil is 4th. So Brazil is very important on this issue. And they pledged to cut back on it. Now, what that did was it kind of wrecked the united front that Brazil, India, and China had put up and put some pressure on the Indians and the Chinese to follow suit. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens when the next round of climate talks is held in Mexico City at the end of the year. So Brazil has shifted slightly, and that's a good sign. Whether it's going to deliver on its word is another issue, and we need to be attentive to that. Otherwise, this destruction is going to continue. 20% of the Amazon has been raised, I would say, in the last, let's say, since 1970. At that rate, it's not going to be a sustainable environmental system by the middle of the century. So it's really, really important what happens in Brazil in the next decade or so.
Have the microphone here.
Well, about 20 years ago, I worked with a fellow who was married to a lady from Brazil, and in traveling back and forth, he would talk about the high crime rate there. I'm wondering how that has changed, particularly with regard to the efforts to decrease the income inequality.
Guess what? It's gotten worse, unfortunately. On the outskirts of every large major Brazilian city, there's enormous crime problems. Rio is kind of the showcase city, and it's also the showcase for the problem because of the geography of the city, where you have neighborhoods on the beach, and then behind that you have mountains, and you have squatter settlements, the favelas. I don't know how many people here have seen that movie, City of God, which deals with this issue. And frankly, the drug gangs control those favelas. And they, with that money that they make from drugs, they've been purchasing firepower that's pretty impressive, and in some cases better than what the police have. And they can dictate to store owners in Ipanema, we want you to close your doors on Thursday, and they have to follow that order. I can remember grenade and mortar attacks on City Hall in Rio, and this is 2007. Now this is a public security issue for Brazilians, but it's also an issue that's going to be important for the rest of the world for 2 reasons. Brazil has gotten the World Cup of Soccer in 2014, and Rio has got the Olympics in 2016. Brazil used these 2 events as a kind of coming out party, a way to say to the world, here we are, we've emerged. Just as Japan used the Tokyo Olympics in 1964, or Beijing Olympics for China in 2008. But there's a possibility, I don't want to say probability, but there's a possibility that this issue of security could spoil that party. Because if people from all over the world are going to go to Brazil, they want to know that they're going to be safe. And nobody in a position of authority in Brazil can honestly make that, offer that guarantee. Now, just last month, for example, there was an incident that got a bit of publicity in which an armed gang from one of the big Rio favelas, the one called Rocinha, it's actually the largest favela in the city, they came swooping down from their mountainside down to the beach where a big tourist hotel, the Intercon, is located, and they took over the hotel and took hostages. Now, you can't have that if you're going to have the World Cup and the Olympics. That's got to be dealt with. But how do you do it? Ordinary Brazilians don't trust the police. The police are viewed as incompetent and corrupt and trigger happy. So the people living in the favelas, they feel like they're caught between two equally unappetizing armed forces. And it's going to be an uphill climb to win for the public security forces to win the confidence of that population.
We're going to work to your right, and then we've got to get back over to the other side again.
Wasn't there a kind of a big controversy between Brazil and the EU and the United States on subsidies for agriculture the last couple of years or a couple of years ago?
Yes.
Where has that gone?
Well, Brazil has argued that if there's going to be free trade, it should be really free trade and not just an industry where the North has the comparative advantage. It should also be in agriculture where they've got the comparative advantage. And they have, in fact, railed against the huge subsidies that the EU has. I mean, agriculture in Europe is essentially kept alive through those subsidies. And they've also been really critical of us. For example, I mentioned ethanol. One of the reasons why ethanol is not more, ethanol based on sugarcane, which is what the Brazilians produce, rather than ethanol made from corn, which is what we have. One of the reasons that Brazilian ethanol hasn't penetrated the American market is that we stick a 54-cent a gallon tariff on every gallon, that they would want to send up here. And so they've gone to the World Trade Organization on cotton and on orange juice, and they've gotten rulings favorable to them and against the Europeans and against us. And they are entitled to compensation, and right now, exactly what form that compensation will take is being negotiated by the governments involved.
Question over here.
Larry, in your presentation, which was really excellent about the potential of Brazil in general, that great phrase of it'll always be the great nation. What was the phrase again?
Yeah,
always will be.
Brazil's the country of the future and always will be.
Now going back to when you were talking about something, and you probably all had 30 seconds to address it, but it sounds like there's a checkmate coming up here. You've got a nation with enormous resources, which you've brilliantly outlined, but then you have alluded
Bottlenecks.
to the human factor, the fact that there is simply not the entrepreneurial spirit, there's simply not the technology training, et cetera, sufficient to drive Brazil into the ranks of the first-class technologies that China now has, Europe and America. Did I hear that correctly?
Well,
What's the prognosis there?
I think the spirit is there.
Oh yeah, always will be.
The opportunities depend on a number of factors, starting with education, and then followed by access to capital. Brazil has done quite a bit in this regard. I mean, I mentioned early on the Brazilian investment group that bought Anheuser-Busch and just bought Burger King. But there are other examples of Brazilian companies that have really vigorously exploited the opportunities that are there. So let me talk about that while acknowledging the bottlenecks that you're asking about. The leading meat packer in the world is a company called JBS Friboi, and it was founded by a butcher's son in an interior state that grows cattle, that raises cattle. And when Brazil had an economic crisis in 1998, early 1999, that required a devaluation, this small family business saw an opportunity there and got loans and expanded its exports. In 2007, they bought Swift. Last year, they bought Pilgrim's Pride. Last year, they passed Tyson's as the leading meat packer in the world. They now say that they want to also be active in the dairy industry. Now, this is an example of that entrepreneurial spirit, and they were able to capitalize on the opportunities that were there. There's lots of areas in which Brazil can do that. There's a steel company, Gerdau it's called, that is buying up steel plants in North America, both the United States and Canada, that have fallen into disuse, and applying their techniques and bringing these plants back to life. So there's lots of things, but money and schools, that's really what it boils down to. And I don't know that Brazil's going to be able to keep up with the demands for trained labor, and that may then require them to allow more people to immigrate. You're already starting to see that in unskilled labor even. Bolivians and Paraguayans coming in. And for skilled jobs, Argentines and Chileans. I think we're probably going to see more of that. And gosh, I've been doing a lot of talks to universities, and I'm hearing American students saying, I want to go down there and take advantage of those opportunities. So I think they're going to find a way to muddle through. Probably won't be the ideal solution, but they will muddle through.
Question in the back, and then we want to get to the far side, then we'll come back over here to the front and try to get to as many people as we can.
Despite these limiting factors, it appears that the standard of living is on the increase, and that usually brings with it investment opportunities in areas other than the most obvious ones, perhaps power generation, food, healthcare. So are there any investment themes that you would care to comment on? Also, there's a lot of money moving into the economy from here and elsewhere around the world. Is that money chasing an economy proportionally, or is it actually having a disproportionate effect on asset prices?
No, I don't think asset prices are being inflated. It may get to that point, but really a lot of Brazilian assets I think were undervalued. The two biggest companies, for example, they're the darlings of investors right now, Petrobras, which I've been talking about, and then a company called CBRD, or just Vale. The B stands for Vale. It's a mining company that was government controlled and then privatized in the 1990s, and controls really the largest reserves of iron ore in the world. So those are two things that stand out. And one thing I'm noticing as an investment strategy that people are mentioning to me, in China, you can't be sure about the rule of law. You can't be sure that your investment is protected. And one way to kind of invest indirectly in China is to invest in Brazil because of this triangular relationship that I mentioned early on, that Brazil is such an important supplier to the Chinese. Now, I'm not trying to say that the rule of law in Brazil is perfect either, because it's not. There's corruption in the judicial system. There's a lot of other problems. But it certainly offers more guarantees than China does. And as a result of that, it's become a favorite target for investors. I'm not sure if this is going to be a record year this year. Last year, I believe, was. And this year has been looking pretty upbeat as well. And the Sao Paulo stock market last year was, I think, the largest overall increase in the value of its assets, 89%, something like that. So, at a time when, our economy and other developed economies are suffering, it makes Brazil look pretty attractive.
On the far side over here.
You talked a little bit about the enormous growth in industry and agriculture and the dams and oil and gas. Could you speak a little bit to the policy, the environmental policies that are in place or need to be in place?
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of talked about the Amazon already, so let me do something else, which is to talk about hydropower, which is really controversial because you build these dams and you get these huge areas flooded. The flashpoint right now is a dam project called Belumonte, and that's on the Xingu River in the eastern Amazon. Brazil loves these huge hydropower projects. There's Itaipu, which until the Chinese built the Three Gorges, that was the largest dam in the world. I mean, not largest physically, but in terms of generating power. Tucuruí, also in the Amazon, another mega project. Brazil goes in for these big projects. There is debate and resistance to that policy, and in fact, it's one of the issues that drove the Minister of Environment out of Lula's government because she thought that development was being favored over sustainability and economic policies and environmental policy. And she is the third candidate in the presidential election right now. She's showing 10 or 11% of the vote. So that's a good percentage. It shows that there's a part of the Brazilian electorate that's really concerned about this. But you see, it's still a minority. The bulk of the people, I think, feel that, well, heck, let's build those dams. Let's not have power shortages or outages down here in the cities of the South. Let's continue to build and let that will take the hindmost. I don't know how it's going to be resolved, but it's definitely there on the table as an issue in the coming years. Where are we going now?
Could you comment, is there any truth to the rumors that our present administration is facing loan guarantees for offshore oil development in this new field Brazil is? So about $20 billion.
Well, actually, I don't know if there's truth to that. I know the Chinese are making loan guarantees. They've done barter deals. So, if the Chinese are getting in on the ground floor, what does that say that we should do? I don't know. At the moment, I think they are just rumors. But I'm sure that it's being discussed in the government. As a matter of fact, I know that Arturo Valenzuela, the Deputy Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, he was just over in Beijing and Shanghai last month, I believe it was, as part of a regular consultative project in which the U.S. and China talk about joint infrastructure development efforts. So it's a possibility, and I don't know, it doesn't strike me as necessarily being such a bad thing.
Well, it seems a little disingenuous that we would invest in that option before drilling and have moratoriums on our own. So
Well, I'm not going to talk about domestic U.S. politics. I'm going to stick to Brazil.
Larry, in America, we talk more and more about energy independence. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the Brazilian perspective, since they basically have energy independence. What is their viewpoint of resource nationalization?
Well, let's see. Petrobras started out as a state company, and only when the military dictatorship came to power was foreign capital welcomed and able to come in. So the trend has been away from resource nationalization as far as oil and gas has gone. But as I mentioned, there's this sense that, well, we got this bonanza, so why should we share it with the foreigners? So there are people in the Workers' Party, which is a left-wing party, who have this kind of nostalgia for a policy of resource nationalization. Now, as regards the other two legs of the energy tripod, with ethanol, when President Bush went to Brazil in 2007, there was an agreement signed for cooperation between the United States and Brazil. I'm afraid that not much has come of it, other than that initial, accord. But Brazil wants ethanol to become a worldwide commodity, and it can't have that take place when it is really the only producer. What they were hoping to get out of that agreement with the U.S. was a chance to license their technology and their equipment to, let's say, small sugar-producing islands in the Caribbean that could then export that stuff to the United States. They're confident enough of their dominance in this field to want to be able to spread it all around and have ethanol become a commodity like anything else. That's the only way the Japanese are going to buy ethanol from the Brazilians to help solve their problems. Our policy is we don't want to go from a dependency on Saudi Arabia to a dependency on Brazil, right? And the Brazilians keep saying, we're not Saudi Arabia, we're different people. And I think that they are sincere in their desire to internationalize that resource, not nationalize, but internationalize.
Thank you very much for speaking to us this evening. I enjoyed everything that you said. My question is this. An acquaintance of ours is a computer programmer. And when he has an overflow of business, he contracts with a group of programmers in Brazil. He claims he pays these programmers anywhere from $5 to $15 per hour US dollars. That displaces, in my opinion, skilled people here in the US who may have been making $50,000 to $60,000 per year doing the exact same thing. How much of this do you see going on in Brazil, and what effect do you see it having on our skilled technical people, or maybe in other industries here in the United States?
I don't think of Brazil as that being that important a center of backroom operations. I'm kind of surprised to hear that it's going on, because there is the language problems. To the extent that that's been taking place in Latin America, it's been going to Uruguay. So I'm really curious to learn more about what the specifics of the situation you're describing. I think that there are more opportunities for Americans to go to Brazil than a threat of displacement, because the Brazilian expertise is largely in areas that they're not competitive with us. I've mentioned ethanol now several times. Genome coding, Brazil is very important in that, but they focused on tropical plants. Think of another example. Well, you get the idea. Again, it's this policy of niches. And they're not going head on to compete with us, let's say the way the Chinese do. Niches, that's what I say.
Far side over here.
Larry, growing up, my two memories of Brazil is Pele and a military dictatorship. And I was wondering if you could comment on what happened in the 80s that facilitated the military getting out and running the government. And secondly, what is your prognosis for the military truly staying out of future Brazilian politics?
Well, let me answer the second question first. One of the things that's happened in recent years is that the civilian government has, number one, starved the budget of the military to make sure that they don't have the capacity to mess about as they've done in the past. Aircraft and tanks and all the toys are really lacking. And the other thing is that Fernando Henrique Cardozo in 2000 created a single defense ministry with a civilian defense minister that brought the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force under civilian control for the first time in Brazilian history. And that was very important. Now, how did Brazil go back to democracy? The military, and I almost hate to say this because I was a constant critic of the Brazilian military when the dictatorship was in power, and was always writing these stories about human rights abuses. But to their credit, they never envisioned themselves staying in power forever, the way Pinochet did in Chile, or the way the junta did in Argentina. They began a system of abertura, was the word they used, opening, by the mid-70s, a decade after they had taken power. And it took them another decade to get to the point where they felt comfortable enough handing power over to a civilian government. They were extremely unpopular by then, but it was a guided transition. And look at 20 years later. I mean, well, less. No. In 2002, Lula was elected president. He was everything that the military coup in 1964 was about. He was a left-wing labor leader, a rabble-rousing peasant, as they saw it. And yet, the world didn't end. Brazil didn't collapse. The relationship between Lula and the military is fairly cordial. So it was a very successful transition. Much more successful in some respects than what Argentina and Chile have been through over roughly the same time period.
In Brazil, the farmers have destroyed many thousands of acres of rainforest, which is very important in many parts of the world because the rainforest is the only place in the world that is raising a lot of herbs and so forth. So is Brazil trying to slow down the destruction of all the rainforest?
Well, yes, I mean, it's trying. Part of the problem is, and I don't think you really fully appreciate this until you travel in the Amazon and you see how vast it is and how difficult it is to control. So there are good intentions on the part of the Brazilian government, but I would argue, and Brazilians get mad when I say this, but it's true, they don't have full effective sovereignty over all of the Amazon. So it's easy for cattle ranchers, it's easy for timber merchants, loggers, and people like that to go to certain areas and just get away with the murder of the forest. So they've got to figure out those guys used to do that with government credit. The government now has cut off the credit, but they still find ways to get around it. Now, one of the things they're trying to do is to encourage, there's so much fertile, tillable land in the area south of the Amazon, what's called the Cerrado. There's a savanna that's vast, it stretches from over 1,000 miles. They're trying to encourage people to settle and develop that, and thereby minimize damage to the rainforest. But they've got to get control, effective physical control of the Amazon in order to blunt that onslaught.
Well, thank you very much, Larry.